was quite happy to come talk about this because I know a lot of times what happens when there's a wildfire event, wineries a lot of times declassify their wines and all of a sudden you get a lot of smoked out things into the bulk market, but that doesn't take away the potential problem. You still have to do something to that wine. So as a reminder, for those of you that haven't seen myself or Anita or Tom talk, what happens is when you have a wildfire and there's smoke and the smoke gets into your vineyard, and it's not all smoke. We're starting to realize the closer you are to the fire, the more problematic the smoke is. The compounds that make smoke smell like smoke can be absorbed into the cellular structure of the grapes. So I have been repeating this for about 8 years now. Washing the grapes are not going to take care of the problem. The compounds are inside the grapes. What makes smoke taint or smoke impacts really tricky is those things that make smoke smell like smoke. Once they get into the grapes, sugars become attached. And the minute a sugar becomes attached, it doesn't have an aroma or flavor to it anymore. So you might go out, taste your grapes after a smoke event and be like, these taste great, I don't have any problem. And that's unfortunately not the case, because once those grapes go through fermentation, there's a lot of enzymes during your fermentation, the acidic conditions. Those sugars can be cleaved off, and all of a sudden you have something that's more aroma and flavor active again. And unfortunately, it can take 9 months up to a year before you get sort of a stable wine where that balance of smoke compounds stabilizes. So there's a lot of effort that can go into making that wine, and then all of a sudden you realize you have something that tastes smoke tainty. I will describe what that means. The compounds we're interested in, volatile phenols, so guaiacol, 4-methyl-guaiacol, the cresols, syringol. Those bound compounds, a lot of times I've put up here called phenolic glycosides. I sometimes refer to them as bound smoke compounds. These are the ones with the sugars, again, not aroma active, whereas our volatile phenols, and in this case, smoke phenols, because there are other volatile phenols associated with other spoilage. So smoke phenols. And then we've started to uncover some other compounds as well that are driving some of the flavors. And the flavors that happen, this is not something that makes your wine taste nice. So that's why it's a problem, because a lot of times people are like, hey, we use oak, that's smoky. That's fine. I describe it as I've put a smoke-tainted wine in my mouth. Normally I would spit it. And about 30 seconds later, I get a mouthful of old cigarette smoke. Some people say it's like a day-old campfire. I have a friend who described to me how, I won't tell you guys how she came about this, but said it is 100% old ashtray. And I was just like, we'll talk about that later, how you know it exactly tastes like that. So it's considered very negative, and in consumer trials we've done, looking at this specific ashy aftertaste, it is considered problematic to wine consumers, and it is associated with negative emotional responses. So the minute someone has a bad experience with your wine, you might be losing a customer right there. So it is not good. But it's not just as simple as, hey, there was smoke, you've got a problem. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of different types of grape varieties out there. There's a lot of different type of smoke. You can be near the burn site, you can be downstream. And I know this is very tricky, and why we talk a lot about what a lab analysis means is this is one of the best ways to figure out if you might be having a problem before you actually start making your wine. And it is not hugely straightforward. Currently, what is available through labs, you can get your smoke phenols measured. You can get the bound glycosides measures. I highly recommend doing both, because if you tally up those numbers, that is the total potential risk you might have for that wine. We know that the glycosides don't 100% convert over to free phenols, but quite a lot of them can over time. So you don't want to just look at one number. You want to look at both of those numbers to really understand what that product's risk is. And I will let you know, you have a much greater predictability if you have a problem if you do it on a micro ferment or a wine. So Anita Oberholster at UC Davis has shown you're like 90% predictability if you're running your analysis on wine. That drops down to 60%. And that's just because there's so many different things that can happen between grapes and wine. And also the analysis on the grapes isn't as good from a science standpoint for what you're doing in the wine. So we do highly recommend before harvest, picking some grape samples, making those microferments, getting that analyzed. Of course, if you have crop insurance, you might need to get your grapes analyzed, but from knowing what risk level you have. And I've sort of created this line chart here, because what do these numbers mean? So I've put this green level called baseline. These smoke phenols and bound phenols do exist at very low concentrations in grapes. So there's actually naturally there, even if you don't have smoke. They're not high enough to be a problem whatsoever from flavor, but they're there. And there's been a lot of work on what these numbers are, because essentially if your measurements or tests come back and they're within baseline, even if you might have had some smoke in your vineyard, you don't have smoke risk if you're in baseline. So you don't have to worry about that. That's good. The next number that I think is easier to figure out is the red category. So I've put threshold. These are essentially when those phenols, and I consider it the total of the phenols, so the phenols and the bound phenols, are above the perception threshold, or really descriptive recognition threshold for those compounds, when your wine starts having the ashy aftertaste, essentially. And we know that that is that negative flavor perception happening. I didn't necessarily put rejected, though if you get high enough up, like off the scale, and we did see that in 2020, some super high numbers, people were like, what can I do? And it was like, I'm really sorry, you can't do anything at those numbers. But you will be where it is that ashy aftertaste. So you're going to need to do something to try and mask or remove that. And I'm going to talk about that a little afterwards. I go through this part. So that's really when we're talking about a taint category in that red area. You're above these thresholds. Then we have this orange area. And research is trying to make the orange area smaller. But it's essentially you're above baseline, but you don't have an ashy aftertaste. And this essentially means quality is going to be different. It's not necessarily good, not necessarily bad, but it's not going to be the same as if you didn't have smoke. And unfortunately, I can't give you anything else more specific than that, because every single wine is different, so it's going to be different depending on the wine. Whereas if you're at high enough on those thresholds, it doesn't matter what red variety it is, it's going to have ashiness to it. So there's this big question mark. And I can say specifically for mitigating or in talking to wineries, and they're like, what should we do? In sort of this elevated area, you can do something. You can get a wine out. It's not going to be the same wine, but you can get a wine out. If you're slightly above thresholds, so you're above that line, there are mitigations you can do to bring it to orange. But if you're way above threshold, there's not a lot that can be done, unfortunately, for completely removing that. But I'm going to show some examples of how you can reduce the perception of ashiness so it's not the dominant thing happening in your wine. And I did want to just give this paper at the bottom, because currently this is where a lot of that threshold information comes from in red wine for the cresols and phenols. So if you want to find that information, that is the paper for it. I did also want to remind everyone of something. I recently presented this at a scientific conference, because when we talk about thresholds are calculated at the concentration where 50% of the population can perceive it. So that means your wine might be under the known threshold, but someone might still come back and say, hey, that tastes ashy. So everyone's sensitivities are different. This is actually threshold measurements in 3 different Pinot Noirs for some smoke thiols. But what I want to point out is those individual dark dots are individual people's calculated thresholds. The red dot in the middle is the 50%. And then you have this wide range. So not only is threshold different depending on the wine you have, because the chemistry is totally different, but also based on people. So we're actually recommending, and we're working on writing up this paper of maybe we want to calculate the threshold at 80% of the population in this instance for it, particularly because it has such a negative impact. So do remember that when you look at some of these numbers, because you might sit there and taste your wines and be like, hey, we're under this, but it's still kind of ashy. So that's why we always recommend taste your wines, keep notes, and you'll start understanding the baseline and also the concentrations of compounds for your specific wine, what happens with it. So something that we know from a sensory standpoint, and this is actually an output of 150 smoke-tainted red wines. And this is very well established every time I see smoke research. Smoke masks more positive attributes. I've put sort of berry fruits up here and floral. Those compounds don't go away. It's just you have such high concentrations of the other ones. The nice ones aren't perceived. So if we can somehow increase the other side or decrease our smoky, ashy compounds enough, all of a sudden you get more of these positive things that you're looking for in a wine. Another comment I wanted to make, because we always get this a lot, though I think it's slowly decreasing. I'm primarily talking about smoke taint in red wines. There are still issues in white wine, but not as much because of how the winemaking is done. But a lot of times I've had people say, hey, we're gonna make a rosé out of this. You know how I just talked about masking in the previous slide? You make a rosé, you take away a lot of the compounds that mask the ashy aftertaste and smokiness of smoke taint. So a lot of times when people make a rosé, unless they find like everything out of it, it actually makes it worse, perception worse. So we don't recommend making a rosé out of your smoke-tainted wines anymore. We actually recommend trying to make the best red wine you can make, because smoke compounds come out at the start of fermentation. It's not something like it's only at the end. They start coming out within 1 to 2 days of your fermentation. So you want to try and get as many other compounds out there, mouthfeel, so that you make a more complex problem that helps mask some of those negative attributes that happen. So now I want to move a little bit into the mitigation and blending, and the reason I've sort of said blending on this is you're going to see in some results. Some of the results I show, mitigation was done on 100% of the wines, but something that we're starting to see is doing research. Because of how complex perception is, you don't necessarily have to treat 100% of the wine. You can treat a portion of it and then blend it back. So the other thing I want to say is almost all mitigation treatments, well, all of them, as far as I'm aware, they work on free phenols. They don't work on bound phenols. So if you're going to try and do something, you want to try and get those bound phenols into free phenols. And the only current way to do that is with enzymes. But wine is a hugely stressful environment for enzymes. We did some research on tropical fruit aroma. We added a lyase enzymes, which is actually a class of lyase enzymes. Nothing happened. And then 6 months later, a paper came out and said, oh yeah, you had to use 4 times the recommended amount in order for it to happen. So you have to trial your enzymes, because you might add enzymes, and enzymes are not inexpensive, and it might not be doing anything. So definitely talk to people who know enzymes, look at them. I also don't know, I unfortunately wasn't here for your enzyme talk either. But those sugars, it's not just glucose. There's a lot of other sugars these ones are bound to. So you want to try and get enzyme classes that can cover a wide range of those. And unfortunately, that one will also change other qualities in your wine. There are a lot of nice smelling things that are released from those, so maybe that can help. But if you're wanting to try and remove these smoke phenols, you want to try and reduce that bound amount as much as possible. Because if you don't, what could potentially happen? You've compounds that come in the red zone. Your wine, you got measurements, red zone. You're like, great, I'm gonna treat it and remove all the smoke phenols, and then I'm gonna stick it in bottle. Well, bound compounds and free compounds, it's a balance. So over time, those bound ones will release until an equilibrium forms. That's different for every single wine. And all of a sudden, someone opens a bottle and it's ashy again. And that's because of those bound compounds releasing over time. It might not, but it might. For what's happening. So we do recommend trying to get that bound into free if you possibly can. If you're potentially down in that orange area and you want to do something, you might not have to worry about it as much because you have low enough levels that even if a little bit released, it's not going to change perception that much. So I just wanted to talk about fining agents because there's been a lot of fining agents trialed. And one of the things I'm gonna try not to say it too much because I say it with every single slide with these are, mitigation of smoke taint is not selective. There's nothing that just removes smoke taint. A lot of us are working on that, but for those of you, we'll get a little chemistry in here for you. There are lots of phenols, benzene ring with an OH group. There are a lot of compounds in wine that are important that have a benzene ring with an OH group off of it, like your tannins and your color molecules and your non-volatile phenolics, things important for mouthfeel. Nothing is specific, and a lot of these are specific in that they interact with a lot of things, including aroma compounds. So that's one of the issues with a lot of the mitigation. You're not just removing smoke, you're also adjusting other things, but hopefully in the adjustment, the positive things are coming out much more than the negative things. So this has taken some of the earlier work on smoke taint, and essentially they're finding with activated carbon and a mineral source. And I don't know if you guys can see, but the blue is untreated smoked out wine. The red is the activated carbon, and I'm actually gonna also point out the purple because the mineral didn't really work. It looks like it's the activated carbon. So essentially what they found in this one is they could decrease the ashy aftertaste, smoky flavor, and make it so the fruity aroma and flavors were the more dominant characteristic. Now this is quite simple if we think about our wines and all the many descriptors. I have winemakers who once came in and checked off every single descriptor to describe a wine that they said was important. That was 35 different descriptors. So these are just a handful, but you're showing we can decrease it. Notice you can't get it to 0. They didn't get it to 0 on either side of these for what's happening. So, but it's less, and then that comes down to sitting down and tasting and figuring out, is this low enough that you wouldn't have a problem with consumers going out? This is one example of this. We've tried a lot of different fining agents ourselves. We also get a shift in, we actually managed to remove all floral aroma completely by accident using some different fining agents. So do trial your fining agents for it. We even tried to see if removing like enzyme activity in the mouth changes it. Yeah, wine tastes really gross if you don't have saliva or enzymes in your mouth. But a lot of the fining agents affect a lot of different things. So it's not just removing that one, but you can certainly, as these show, decrease it to some extent. Now I want to talk a little bit about blending, because you might think, hey, it's linear. I can just blend it to a point where it's not going to be perceptible anymore. And we're going to see that's not necessarily the case, but kind of, I think the results are interesting in a good way. This is a study done with 2020 Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa. It was definitely smoke tainted. And then we were looking at blending it with a non-smoked out wine from the next year. So we've got a range of dilutions all the way down to 50% smoked, 50% non-smoked. And what we can see from what's happening is we don't get a linear response. Essentially how you read this sort of graph, and I apologize if it's not as dark as it should be, is if you follow the vectors from the middle out, that is the more dominant flavor compound here. So we can see if looking at your right, the wines in that direction, very much red fruit, dark fruit is the main driving perception characteristic of those wines. If we go to the left, you start getting that ashy aftertaste, smoky, vegetative, chemical taste. And we can actually see that in the blends going from 100% smoked to the lowest blend, so 5% smoked, 95% not smoked, was perceived as the highest ashy aftertaste. And there's a lot of chemistry that goes into this and perception that we're trying to work out for it. But a lot of people might say that's the one we should have done because we should have the lowest amount of smoke compounds, but clearly that's not the case. What actually I find quite interesting is the 50% smoked and the 10% smoked align with the non-smoked. So I thought this was very interesting because, hey, I could take 50% smoked out wine and actually blend quite a bit of it to something that would be considered maybe closer to wanting to put that out on market. I almost wanted to say it was acceptable, but we didn't do an acceptance test for this, so I can't confirm that for you. But that's a lot more you can do with blending than having to get a whole lot of non-smoked wine out. And then if you wanted to push it a little bit more floral, that 15% smoked out is moving in the floral direction. So you could have a couple different, if you were looking for different style of wine there. Now on a different set of Cabernet Sauvignon wines, same year, similar location, they took the smoked out wine and they treated it, and then they looked at blending it with the non-smoked version. Again, these were quite significantly smoke tainted. They wanted to see if that could get closer to the quality of wine they were looking for. In this case, it was a carbon treatment. I put the amount on there. Slightly different blends, but going all the way down to that 50% smoke affected with 50% Oh, that didn't say it properly. It's 50% carbon treated with 50% non-smoked wine in this as the greatest one. And we see something, it's not quite as clear cut, but something a little more similar happening. Again, our 50% carbon treated with 50% non-smoked is very close to our non-smoked control wine. We're seeing a little bit more of a spread happening. So if you were looking more red fruit floral, 25% carbon treated is certainly pushing more in that direction, but showing that actually the 50% smoked that was treated, blending with the 50% non-smoked, again, is actually showing very similar to that non-smoked control. And then the last one is, it's a resin. I don't know it's SRX, if I remember correctly. It's proprietary. I don't remember the company where it came from. But there are a lot of different resins out there. And the nice thing about some resins is they should maybe be able to get a little more specific in what they're taking. Again, not specific enough for just smoke, but not as wide acting, say, as carbon would be. And again, this is just another blending trial for it. And you can see, again, that 50% resin treated and 50% non-smoked out wine is grouping again with our non-smoked control. So while I can't say this would be the same for your wines, because this was 2020 Cabernet Sauvignon, I would certainly say please go out if you're looking to mitigate things, blend your wines and see what percentage works for that wine. It might be a lot higher than you think. So you might not need to have a little bit of smoke-tainted wine with a lot of non-smoked wine. You might actually be able to have a chunk of just not smoked out wines or treated smoked out wines that you can then use for whatever product you're trying to have. And again, try and release those bound compounds before mitigating things. The last thing I don't have research on, but it has been done quite extensively, and is probably one of the better mitigation treatments, also have to try and put bound to free for it, is running it through reverse osmosis. I know it can be pricey. And I do say a lot of this depends on your, the economics for what you're trying to do. I think from an economy of scales, it works a little better at bigger scale, but you're adding cost on as you're doing all of this. So I don't have that information for you, and it would, of course, depend on the size of your company and where you're placing your wines. But reverse osmosis has been found to be quite successful at removing it. The one thing we haven't seen is sort of that, do I have to do everything? Normally people just go in and do reverse osmosis on everything, so 100% of the wine. But you might not have to do it on 100% of the wine for what's happening. Again, you could blend that out. And here's just an example of how this shifted. Reverse osmosis is particularly effective if you're in that orange or really close to that threshold range. So if you see the red, the untreated wines, and this is Pinot Noir, are in solid, and the dotted lines are the reverse osmosis treated one. And you can see for the Pinot Noir 2, which was not as smoke impacted as Pinot Noir 1, so the red versus the, we'll call it blue or black, it actually was able to decrease the smokiness and ashiness closer to 0. So this is more effective at lower levels. But even at the higher levels, we do see a bit of a decrease in those attributes as well. So it is something workable. But again, cost coming down, and you do need a certain amount of volume to run this through as well. And the last thing I'm going to say, which came out of trying to figure out how to taste wine without having false positives. So what I mean by that is you just tasted a smoked out wine, then you quickly taste another wine and you say, oh, that's smoke tainted, when it isn't. Because smoke lingers in the mouth for a long time. So we tried to figure out a lot of rinses so that wouldn't happen. And the current rinse we recommend is actually, I think it's 4 grams per liter glucose. But we also found out that wines that were a little sweeter, as in they had more sugar, maybe didn't taste sweet, you don't perceive it as strongly, the same concentration. And we haven't published it yet. But what we think is happening, so the hypothesis is we think you have sugar in there that is competing with the binding sites and the enzymes in your saliva and on your tongue. So you're essentially not perceiving the compound as much. It says there's lower levels of that because you have more of the sugar there. So I do that this is something where maybe you do all those other things and you're able to decrease ashy aftertaste even more by adding a little bit residual sugar to your wine. Again, it doesn't have to taste sweet. We've done this where 4 grams per liter as a rinse doesn't taste sweet. So you can start looking at this as well and seeing some of those masking and the sugars as well. And I've not done this with, I think people were talking about different non-calorie sweeteners and things. I don't know the rules with that, but I've just done it with actual sugars at this point. But yeah, there is sort of that masking a little bit or stopping of the release of those compounds. So just as the takeaways, you don't necessarily need to treat 100% of the wine. And depending on how much you're working with, that could be a substantial amount that you don't have to put through some sort of treatment that would have an additional cost to it. For the ones I showed today, those 50-50 blends were actually the closest to the non-smoked out. That the company was actually, one of them they did end up tweaking it a little bit more in other ways, but they did end up releasing that wine in 2020. And I am a medium smoke taster. I thought it tasted great. I have a colleague that's like ultra sensitive. He's like, it's a little ashy. And it's like, yeah, but you're like unique in the group of people. So you can get it to the point where the majority of your wine consumers are not going to notice what's happening. And yeah, this is just where some of the work was funded and the students who did it. And if anyone has any questions about essentially anything in smoke taint, I'm director for one of the large projects. I'm more than happy, shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to talk about anything or let you know where research is going for it. But thank you so much for sticking around, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.